WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and AM 1570. We are BaltimorePositive.com. You can find us out on the internet as we get ready for a long week of waiting. And the waiting's always the hardest part. It was so weird all day Sunday watching football and all night Sunday night watching Josh Allen do his thing. And the Ravens don't get back after it until next Monday night, which gives Luke, as well as John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta, plenty of time to think about things. Luke Jones joins us now. We are going to be doing the Maryland Crab Cake Tour in my homeland of Dundalk on Friday, be Drug City, at the Fountain at Drug City. I've already got like a litany of guests. Everybody in Dundalk wants to stop by. So if you want to stop by, buy some beer, have a crab cake, have a milkshake, get some baseball cards, some wrestling magazines, do all the stuff I used to do at Drug City. We'll be there from 2 until 5. It's all brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Lottery. I have some fresh scratch-offs to give away. Roz has set me up this week with some fresh scratch-offs, maybe some Game of Lifers, as well as our friends at Goodwill and Window Nation, where it's still buy 2, get 2 free. I'll be telling you about that all month long. 866-90-NATION. Luke, what are you doing this week, man? Has Harbaugh sent out, of course he won't do anything in advance, but is Thursday, Wednesday, and Wednesday, Thursday? And what's going on with the Ravens? Because they're seeing a team that looked pretty decent on Sunday.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, old friend Andy Dalton, who was not so friendly to the Ravens in the past at different times for all the jokes about the red rifle and Bengals going to bungle at the worst time. Andy Dalton's actually quietly played some decent football. And I think what's relevant about it is they've been really banged up at wide receiver. You know, they haven't had Michael Thomas out there, which isn't anything new for the Saints. They haven't had Jarvis Landry. Olave's been on and off the field a little bit. But I think the big key for him was, and the big question for going into next Monday night, knowing that we are embarking on the trade deadline being imminent, is Alvin Kamara. Huge day for the Saints against the Raiders. And by the way, putrid effort by Las Vegas, just terrible. But that aside, Saints played really well. And I said this to you in our post game in the aftermath of Thursday night's win over Tampa Bay, where I said, look, don't let the Saints record fool you entirely. They've actually played some okay football at times. They've just been bad the other times. And well, that adds up to having a losing record. But in that division, with Tampa Bay struggling the way that they've struggled, it's wide open. So it's going to be fascinating to see, not just the Saints, but you could probably say that about, I don't know, at least a half dozen to 10 teams in the league that we speculate whether teams are going to be buyers or sellers. But keep in mind, since expanding the playoff field by an extra team in each conference last year, you do wonder about these teams, especially when they're in a division where no one's running away with it, where they say, are we really going to punt on the rest of the year, or are we going to give it a shot? And many times that can be ill-advised to give it a shot because making the playoffs is not the same thing as having a chance to win a Super Bowl. But it is a Saints team that looked pretty good Sunday, as you mentioned. And it was a strange Sunday in general, I think, for Ravens fans, not just because they didn't have a game and you could sit back and relax, but waiting on Bengals Browns until Monday night, checking out the Steelers against Philadelphia, and the Steelers still aren't any good. I mean, maybe they will be later in the year, but they stink right now. And you see Philadelphia looking really, really impressive. But it was just kind of strange in that sense because you tend to focus on those divisional teams, and the Ravens still couldn't watch the Bengals or the Browns until Monday night. So interesting week in that way. As you mentioned, an extra day. I assume, as you laid it out, Wednesday will be Thursday this week. And
that really makes it like a bye, right? I mean, if they don't have to come to work until Thursday, kind of, sort of, in a real way, it's an interesting week for them.
They're not having off until Thursday. I'm just saying more so from a media regular week where the first injury report will be Thursday. They'll be back in, but they did get a few extra days of rest, which I think is big, especially when you're talking about the injuries that they sustained on Thursday night. Nothing
especially
major,
big when you win. When you win, it's awesome. If you lose on Thursday night, the extra days, if they're 4-4, it feels a lot different having extra days than it does. It feels like they're getting extra breath now all of a sudden. And we start talking about them in a different light, even when New Orleans plays well and we have expectations for Monday night. But I think our expectations for this football team have changed based on them winning a couple of games within a 96-hour period.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if expectations have changed. I think confidence level has changed. I think the expectations were always there, but when you're blowing fourth quarter leads and you're sitting there at 3-3 a couple of weeks ago, it's tough to feel confident about where they're going, even if a lot of the underlying numbers have still looked pretty good overall. So, but you win, you get a chance to rest up, gives Mark Andrews some time, and we'll see. Is Andrews going to play against the Saints? Is Gus Edwards going to play against the Saints? Ideally, you'd like to have them, but at the same time, you have to understand the big picture in the same way we were talking about this going into the Tampa Bay game, where you still have to look at it through a big picture lens. And if Mark Andrews has, whether it's a sprained AC joint, as I've seen some of the Twitter doctors speculate, or whatever it might be, if you can rest him up and still find a way to win on Monday night, and then have him fully healthy coming out of the bye week, then I think that's something you have to take a long look at. But certainly the vibe is much better than it was at the end of the first half on Thursday night, with how they were playing compared to how they came out in the second half and ran the ball right down Tampa Bay's throats and got a win on the road. And then you get a chance to put your feet up over the weekend and see what the rest of the NFL looks like, which is kind of what we've talked about. A couple teams, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Kansas City was on the bye this week, but beyond those teams, I don't think there's too many teams that the Ravens look at and say, they're no better than us, right? I mean, they're not in a different league than us.
I'm not sure how good Philadelphia is. I mean, we start throwing them in because they're undefeated. We saw the Giants, have their problem. The teams with one loss, and you get to this point in the season, and you're like, are you a real good team, or have you just been playing good for a month or two? I see that in Buffalo and Kansas City. Philadelphia, I'm still, jury's out on them for me. No matter how gaudy their record gets, I need to see them beat a Buffalo or a Kansas City for me to think that they're that team. For me. And I feel that way about the Ravens. I mean, the Ravens had their opportunities with Buffalo, and they've had their opportunity to climb that mountain and be that team. They're much like during the Billick era, much like during most of the Harbaugh era, it feels like they're going to have to go do that on the road in January this year, like they have every other year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little higher on Philadelphia than you. I mean, they have a plus 78 win differential. They beat the pants off the Steelers on Sunday, and Jalen Hurts looks like he's kind of taken that leap from year 2 to year 3. And I'm not saying he's going to be the unanimous MVP. Let's be clear about that. But his year 2 to year 3 jump has reminded me a little bit of Lamar's jump from his rookie year to year 2. And what do you know? You acquire A.J. Brown, a legitimate stud number 1 wide receiver, and you see what kind of difference he makes. I mean, he made some tremendous throws
in that game. He went up in the end zone on that early in the game and just took the ball away from 2 guys. And I'm like, okay, man, we don't have anybody doing that.
Yeah.
We haven't had anybody doing that since maybe Steve Smith or Anquan Bolden, quite frankly.
I mean, Mark Andrews does it over the middle of the field, but on the outside making a play. I mean, but at the same time, Jalen Hurts made some great throws in that game as well. So I'm impressed by him. I'm very much impressed by Philadelphia. I had a couple people in my life heard me last week say, because I think Buffalo is better than Philadelphia, they're giving me a hard time about that. Philly, to me, is clear cut the best team in the NFC right now. They beat Dallas a couple weeks back without Prescott, so whatever that looks like.
By the way, the NFC feels like to me, right? None of these teams, like San Francisco brings 100,000 people down the coast to LA. I mean, it's crazy. Welcome to the home of the Rams and the things to see of red. It's crazy. And I didn't think 49ers fans were that engaged, man. They've got something they can hate all of a sudden, and somewhere they can go once a year and take the place over. They haven't had a chance to do that. But I look at the Rams and the Bears looked okay last Monday night. Then they don't anymore. This is an on-off league for a lot of teams. I mean, I'll say this for the Ravens. They haven't had off weeks. They've had off fourth quarters, right? But, I mean, double-digit leads in the fourth quarter in every game, blah, blah, blah. Okay. They've been pretty consistently like they show up. Some of these teams, to your point, PU on the Raiders. I mean, even the Commanders are showing up and winning ball games. It's crazy.
Yeah. And it's funny, you made mention of some of these teams, whether you're believing in them or not. How about Minnesota? They're 6-1.
There you go.
They've won 5 in a row. I have no. I mean, what you said about Philadelphia to me described Minnesota much more.
So if Minnesota won 5 in a row, they'd be undefeated, but would they be any good?
Right. Well, and that's where you start looking at it. I mean, Philadelphia's blown out teams a little bit more, and that's definitely something you can point to. In the NFL, we tend to focus on when you go up against other good teams. chances are they're going to be close games, and you're going to win some of those, you're going to lose some of those, right? But the typically the mark of a really good team in the NFL is you blow the doors off the teams that you should, and I feel like Philadelphia has done that for the most part. The Vikings, I mean, they're 6-1. They've got some really good players, but do we really trust Kirk Cousins at this point? I mean, really? Does anyone really trust him? So you look at them and they're 6-1. There's been so much focus on the Giants, the Jets prior to Sunday afternoon, where clearly they missed Breece Hall. I think that was obvious. But I look at Minnesota that way, where okay, they're 6-1, and that division is a mess, so they're running away with it at this point. I mean, are the Packers going to figure it out enough to be able to make a run at them at this point? I'm really skeptical. But are they really a threat in January? I don't know about that. So it is strange, and I think we talk about this more every year, more and more every year. It feels like. So I think it's there's some recency bias at work to think that it's different this year. But there have been I've seen data. There have been more one-score games. There have been more frequent closer games than what we saw in the past. And other than a couple teams at the top, and even on the flip side, I mean, okay, Detroit, fine. They've lost 5 in a row. All their hard knocks mojo that people were trying to talk up, I think that's done at this point. But there aren't that many truly terrible teams either. I think there's just such a mass of parity, mediocrity, sometimes good, sometimes bad. I mean, you even mentioned the Ravens, sometimes within a game.
Well, you mentioned how bad the Steelers looked on Sunday and whatever. Like, we still got to play them twice. I don't look at that as 2-0. Yeah. I just don't. Well, I look at that as a 1-1 that can be a 2-0, but it better not be an 0-2 because they're not very good. But I still think the Raiders will beat some teams the rest of the way, no matter how bad they looked on Sunday.
Oh yeah, that's fair. Yeah, and when I say the Steelers stink, I'm saying relative to what they normally are. And again, could they be better later in the year? And the Ravens they go to Pittsburgh December 11th, and then they host the Steelers on New Year's Day. So we're still talking a month plus until you see the Steelers for the first time. Does Pickett start playing better by then? I mean, Chase Claypool threw their touchdown pass on Sunday. So
I'm wondering who the Ravens running back is going to be then, and how this trading deadline thing, right? Yeah. I mean, this is an interesting week in that Eric's made it interesting in the past, and Eric's one of the guys who does do deals, and Eric is a guy with the phone up to his head on Halloween trying to figure out I heard DJ Moore. Let's hope he keeps his helmet on if they deal him in here, right?
Yeah. Although DJ Moore, yes, he messed up that first extra point, but come on, the kicker missed a chip shot in overtime. Like at some point, you can't blame DJ Moore exclusively for that. But I think for the Ravens at the trade deadline, it's fascinating from the standpoint of, let's face it, there are probably 2, 3, maybe 4 positions where you could say they could very much benefit from an upgrade. A wide receiver, I don't need to belabor that point. People hear me talk about that 12 months out of the year. But I think
it's your new secondary.
Yeah. Well, but on the secondary side, who's the third corner? We've continued to see, whether it's Demarion Williams, whether it's Brandon Stevens, Ardarius Washington a few weeks back was called up from the practice squad, and we saw him. They're searching for that number 3 corner spot. And I think Thursday was a reminder of seeing Marlon Humphrey on and off the field a little bit with the hamstring issue. What happens if something happens to Humphrey or Marcus Peters? You'd like to have another corner. And whether that means you go out and get a former Pro Bowl corner, or whether you just get a guy that you think offers a higher floor, it's you kind of go back to losing Kyle Fuller week 1. That was a tough loss. Not that I was convinced that Kyle Fuller was going to play at a really high level, because he had a really rough 2021, but he was a veteran player, someone that you theoretically are hoping raises the floor at that position. So there's that position. Inside linebacker, lots of people have speculated about Roquan Smith for quite a while. And with the Bears having traded Robert Quinn to Philadelphia several days ago, does that happen? Although it sounds like the Bears could be interested in tagging him and maybe trading him next year. So you've got 3 or 4 positions. I mean, edge rusher's always there, although Bowser and Ajabo should be coming back here. They're going to be on the 53-man roster this week because their 21-day window expires. So you have a few different positions that you can potentially address. However, you only have so much salary cap space. We know the Ravens are not going to be a team that's going to trade away all their draft picks. I mean, that's just not their MO. But could the right deal be there where you give up a third or a fourth or some combination of some mid-round picks? Yeah, I mean, we've seen that in the past. We saw it 2 years ago when they got Ngakwe. We saw it 3 years ago when they got Marcus Peters. So it's not as though Eric DeCosta is so risk adverse that he's not going to make a deadline deal. But does the right deal present itself? And I'll go back to what I said about the makeup of this league right now. New Orleans is a perfect example of that. There's been lots of talk about Alvin Kamara and potentially him being dealt at the deadline. He scored 3 touchdowns on Sunday. So how do you view that? Was that a case where that'll sweeten the pot in terms of offers that the Saints get, and maybe they do move him? Or with the Saints having won and shut out the Raiders on Sunday and seeing that the rest of their division, I mean, Atlanta's leading the way at 4-4. No one's believing in the Falcons. No one believes in anyone in that division at the moment. Does that leave the Saints a little more inclined to stand pat and give it a shot with the rest of their core? So I think you have a lot of teams that are making those decisions right now. And fortunately for the Ravens, having won the last 2 and certainly feeling good about what we saw in the second half against the Buccaneers and knowing the expectations remain high for this team, you're hoping that there will be a few more sellers out there between now and the deadline. And we'll be talking about what happens in the aftermath of that. But it's fascinating because 7 playoff teams in each conference. I mean, you have 14 playoff teams. There's 32 teams in the league. So close to half the teams make the playoffs. So how does that impact the trade deadline? And we talk about that in baseball, with the expanded playoff field there and what that meant at the trade deadline. But it does really change what could potentially happen in terms of how these teams view themselves. And you're hoping that the right deal presents itself for the Ravens, because as much as you're encouraged by how they played in the second half against Tampa Bay, I think you want to be really careful not to have too much bravado from how that looked. And I would include the wide receivers there because, what's Rashad Bateman's foot going to look like? How's that going to play out the rest of the year? If that's going to be something that continues to linger, then yeah, I do have concerns about wide receiver. And that's even with saying that Devin Duvernay's had a really strong 2022 season. So, whether it's receiver, corner, inside linebacker, still talk edge rusher. Some people have mentioned running back. I'm not quite as concerned there because, we've seen everyone be, other than Mike Davis, probably be productive running the football. So I think they do have depth there where I'm not as concerned about, the idea of acquiring a running back, but there's certainly 3 or 4 positions where the Ravens could strengthen themselves for the stretch run.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on the Twitter thing, and he will be getting to Owings Mills when they allow him. I'm going to be getting back to Dundalk on Friday for the Maryland Crab Cake Tour. We're going to be down at the Fountain in Drug City. There's a rumor like my son, my former keyboard player, politicians, former teachers, and I lost my English teacher this weekend, Alan Stockett, and I've been paying tribute to him. So I think I'm going to have my yearbooks with me. So there might be readings of poetry and old Inside Wrestling magazines down at the Fountain. By the way, Luke, just aside, because we'll get into baseball, World Series, I gave sort of a shout out that if somebody had tickets, I might go up to Philadelphia because I have a couple of nights free. I'm not doing Monday Night Live at the barn anymore. I'm probably doing Tuesday Night Sweats across the street over in Harford Road these days. But Chip Namias, Chip, right? My former Houston Oiler PR director who's lives out in LA now. He's a friend of mine, Facebook friend, whatnot. We kind of share similar interest in music and sports and pop culture and whatnot. And he's a great guy. He put up a picture right before we came on the air. He spent the day over the weekend with a name that came up in our conversation last week. Jerry the King Lawler is a dear, dear friend of his from the Memphis connection because he grew up in Memphis. He and Jerry the King Lawler got the keys to the Mid-South Coliseum and went on with the lights off just to hang out the other day.
That's awesome.
Pictures up of this. So
Very
I'm thinking,
cool.
one, Lawler's alive and I need to get him on the show.
I could have told you that. I mean,
first things first. So, and we're not going to do straight football here. We don't have a game today and we got World Series and you're vibing outdoors. By the way, Eddie Lauer singled the left field off of Mike Bordick on Saturday down at the Oriole fan runaround appreciation orange carpet thing. So, my eyes are open to more than just, what Chad Steele's doing or not doing. This time that I have alone, this time I'm in media jail, allows me to sort of see what else is going on out in the universe. But certainly the World Series is like on top of us, 90 miles away, as close as it's going to get to here that's not DC. And I don't know, I'm tasting it a little bit for baseball fans, the sounds, the sights. Pre-game show's horrible, by the way, just horrible. I mean, everything about Fox Television is just horrible. I mean, Fox 45, their news is fake. All the ads, the fear like I watch baseball. I'm scared shitless by 11. By the seventh inning, I'm under the covers. I'm like, this country's horrible. But there is a little part of like watching Fox every night and watching baseball. Man, baseball's so good when it's 5-0 in the seventh inning, like a game. Like you're like, hold on here. Philly's got a runner on. They just scored a run. They had a solo home run. Okay, hold on. On deck, tying runs on deck. You start to think in those terms in the seventh, eighth, and ninth inning because it's an ultimate chess match once it gets to this point that they're not going to let pitchers sit out there and roast. And the matchups are interesting to me in this particular series because of how wacky the pitching can be.
Yeah, no question about it. And you know what was funny to me? I was over watching game one on Friday night with my brother-in-law. And what was amazing about that was it was such a good game. I mean, Philadelphia comes back from a 5-0 deficit. I mean, Verlander's perfect through the first 3 innings and then falls apart. And Philadelphia storms back. And I think Dusty left them in too long, quite frankly. And I get it. It's Justin Verlander, but very much, that had kind of fallen apart. But that was a really long game. And you know what? No one mentioned anything about it. Why? Because the action within the game and the game itself was so good. This is why I've said to you over and over, baseball's obsession with time of game. And look, I'm not anti-pitch clock, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds on talking about anything like that. But when it is a good game, when it is a well-played game for the most part, you kind of lose yourself in it, right? And no one's focusing on the fact that, well, I think the time of game, it was over 4 hours. And I get it. It went to 10 innings, but it was only 1 extra inning. But it was fantastic. And, game 2, not as good. And, I think on the Philadelphia side, probably some concern about Wheeler. Didn't look as sharp as he's looked throughout the postseason. And keep in mind, he had an arm issue late in the regular season. So I think that's concerning on the Philadelphia side. But, it's been a fun matchup. And
the Phillies can win, by the way. I don't know when people hear this in a day or two. Maybe it's maybe they're down 3-1 by the time you hear this. But the Phillies can win.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought all along, and it hasn't necessarily played out in the way that you would always expect, because I think, the easy argument to make about them on going into the postseason was you have Wheeler and you have Nola. And, it very much you have 2 studs at the top of your rotation, and you have a team that had to really scratch and claw to get in. And, it becomes a situation where, why not? And it's kind of played out that way. I mean, they were underdogs against St. Louis. They were underdogs against Atlanta. They were, San Diego. I mean, it's been a heck of a run for them. And now they come home and, you've got 3 straight games in Philadelphia. Got to be ready to play. Certainly you got to start fast, but anytime you're the road team that you can go on the road the first 2 games, steal 1. I mean, you change home field advantage, you change your vibe, you come home with a chance that theoretically, it's unlikely, but theoretically you could close it out and not have to go on the road again if you can win 3 in a row, which I'm not expecting that, but I'm in agreement with you. They can win it. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, Houston, pitching's really good. Lineup 1 through 6 is really good, but I mean, we've seen Trey Mancini. I mean, he hasn't hit. You look at the bottom of their order, it's not quite as dominant as maybe the Astros lineup was, say, 3 or 4 years ago. So, Philadelphia comes down to, I think, the big question once you get past Wheeler and Nola. They kind of use Ranger Suarez in that relief role in game 1. So kind of changes what they do with their pitching the next couple games. But it comes down to how the middle of their bullpen stacks up. I mean, they have Alvarado, they have Sir Anthony Dominguez on the back end. Those guys are studs. High leverage guys, throw really hard. But what does Eflin look like? What does Dave Robertson look like? Which, he can be shaky at this point in his career. So it's been a fun series. And game 2 wasn't quite as competitive. I wasn't shocked to see the Astros get off the mat after what happened to them in game
Yeah,
1.
but the doubles to start the game, I thought that at least would be answered 4 hours later. And it wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, and that was tough in that way, but it was fun. So I mean, it's been a good series to this point, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. At the very least, 3 more, and hopefully more than that. I know Philadelphia fans would like to close it out in Philly, but it's been good baseball for the most part, and been dramatic baseball. I mean, you can't ask for much more than what we saw in game 1. So looking forward to see what the rest of the series has in store for us.
The weirdest part is, like, as long as it extends and they split some of these games and it goes back to Houston, Philadelphia and Houston playing football on third. Like, what are the odds of this? And beyond that, how awful the Texans are, and we've already outlined how good the Eagles are, that the Eagles could be undefeated and they could be greasing the polls on Friday or Saturday. I literally just thought about this, just going up to Philly and hanging out. Like, my wife went down to Washington when the Caps were in the Stanley Cup and just watched on the side of the wall or whatever. I thought, if the weather's nice on Tuesday night, I might go up and watch game 4 and just have a cheesesteak and a pretzel and make the vibe happen, because it's been 20 years. I did the math on this over the weekend, because I thought, hey, World Series is starting. It was Friday night. I'm sitting at home. I'm eating some leftovers. I did my show up at Greenmount Station. I brought a crab cake home. They had their sports wagering up there. You'll hear it all week long. I did the Maryland Crab Cake Tour with Chris up there. So I'm like, I wonder how many World Series games I've been to. I bet it's been like 60 or 70, because I started to think about the math of it and how many years. It turned out it was 43. I've been to 43 World Series games. And I guess I just thought in terms of 6s and 7s, and then I realized I only really went to one game in 79. I went to 4 in 83. And then in 93, I started going to games. I went to all 6 games in 93. There was no 94. I know you youngins may have had a hard time dealing with that. Your dad was still alive then, right?
Yeah.
He didn't like that. 94 sucked. I remember 90. I was on the radio in 94.
94 was heartbreaking. And keep in mind, there was, especially from the perspective, I was 11 years old when the World Series was canceled in 94.
Son, there's no Ravens. There ain't going to be no Ravens, right?
Not just that, but the Orioles were all we had, really. I mean, okay, Maryland basketball was coming back at that point with Joe Smith and Gary and everything, but I was thinking, what about Cal Streak? I mean, I'm 11 and I'm the biggest Cal Ripken fan in the world. And you're wondering, what about Cal Streak? What about the fact the Orioles, I get it. They were chasing the Yankees, but they were still pretty good and they had a chance. And, there's the wild card that year. I mean, I was crushed. I was absolutely crushed. And I mean, if the World Series were canceled now, I'd still be disappointed as someone who loves baseball. But as an 11-year-old, I mean, it felt like the strike was about 5 years. I mean, that's how long it feels for a kid. So yeah, I mean that was heartbreaking.
I found my pictures in 95 and 96 and 97 in the snow at Jacobs Field during that Marlins series. I found the picture. My friend Kara Trenikost sent me a picture from 2003. She had a suite in Joe Robbie Stadium for the Marlins and the Yankees the night that Clemens pitched and walked off the mound, and we thought that was the end for him, and he wasn't a drug addict, like all of that. And so, like, the memories I have, like, I was there the night Carter hit the home run. I was in Phillies gear that night, the night Carter hit the home run in the upper deck. So I've had some magic with the World Series, and I kind of wanted to go back through that, and I thought, oh, the only magic I've really had with Baltimore are the Pentex 150 pictures that I took. I had Tyler Kepner on. Maybe you heard that. Tyler Kepner from the New York Times was a Phillies fan. He grew up outside of Philadelphia, and he alludes to his childhood with the 80 Phillies and the 83 Phillies all the time. He did a book on the World Series, which I have for you, by the way, Luke. And he came on, and the first thing I thought is, I have my homemade pictures of Paul Owens in the dugout and Bowie Kuhn and Cal Ripken playing Pepper before the game, and Joe Morgan and Pete Rose and Mike Schmidt, like Tony, all standing next to each other on the first base line. And I'm like, wow, like 83 World Series was pretty cool, man. I have pictures of all this. And I have a picture of the Fanatic and the Oriole Bird dueling out at second base at Memorial Stadium. So like these memories I have, they come back to me, and I think to myself, and I really do think this, is your niece ever going to have a World Series in Baltimore? You know, she's 2 years old. Like, are you ever going to have maybe you should say, are you ever going to have a World Series in Baltimore because you were born the week before the World Series in '83?
Yeah, I was 2 weeks old the last time the Orioles won the World Series. So I was just going to say, forget about my niece for a moment. I mean, I'm going to be 40 years old next year. And all I have is.
So I should want it for you.
No memory whatsoever.
I should want it for Alan McCallum, is what you're telling me.
Well, and yes. Just, I think, look, you think about what's transpired on the greater Baltimore area sports scene over the last 40 years. You know, we've had a football team leave since then, and a team arrive, and a team be very successful and win 2 Super Bowls and be a perennial
and both
contender.
of them have thrown me out for asking tough questions, which I love.
Sure. But you have that. You have Maryland basketball, and you think about what Maryland basketball has been through. I mean, I know, I'm not a hockey guy. I mean, the Caps, go through all the different things that have happened here in Baltimore.
Well, the Caps have won. The Nationals have appeared. The Nationals have won a World Series. Probably could have won a couple, right?
Could have. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, we can go through massive change of facilities and lifestyle, but we're starting to get up on that 1983. They're going to chant it the way they chanted 67 in Toronto, where I'm going next week, because the Maple Leafs haven't won since then. 1914, they would chant at the Red Sox. Like we're getting there now. We're getting way back into last century now here.
Yeah, it's not quite the curse of the Bambino. It's not quite at the Cubs, the Billy Goat curse. It's not that bad, but you're talking 4 decades now. I mean, next year is going to mark 40 years. So yeah, and even talking about it through the lens of now being in sports media and having done this a number of years. I mean, I've covered playoff games. I've covered the Ravens in a Super Bowl. I've been to Radio Row for other Super Bowls, but the novelty of a Super Bowl, hey, it's awesome. It's cool, but I've done it. I haven't covered a World Series game.
Well, let's go to Philadelphia on Tuesday night. You can sniff it out. I'll buy you a pretzel.
Yeah. I mean, it's have you seen the prices? Have you seen the ticket prices in Philadelphia? It's wild. It's wild.
Well, see, I don't think it's wild, because I've been going to World Series games, and I remembered being out in San Francisco in 2002, and tickets were what they were, right? Yeah. The face value, they used to come in strips.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know about all of that. Like the face value of the tickets, I don't know what they are, because I haven't seen printed tickets and all this valuation pricing. I went through this through the play. I do this all the time because it's a little bit like a stock for me, right? Mm-hmm. So I was looking to see how much a Padre game would have been in San Diego versus LA, the difference in pricing between Atlanta and everywhere else, and even Houston, which it's not super expensive to go to Astros playoff games because they've had a lot of them, right? And that's part of the ticket prices never went down in Boston. As an example, all the years the Red Sox were ever in, it was always $1 billion to go to a Red Sox playoff game. There was never a soft night ever. It's a small stadium. Yankee Stadium, you go to Yankee playoff game, you get in for 20, 40, 50 all the time. Like all the time, you could go to Yankee Stadium for any of those playoff games and get in cheap and be a part of it. The Philadelphia experience, I know exactly what the prices were, because I had no interest in going in the first round, interest in going in the second round. I had interest because they were playing the Padres and I was free. My wife's been out of town for a couple of weeks, so I can just jump in the car and go, right? Feed my cat. And it was in the $200 range to get in for the Padres series. The first game was a little more, $250, and I thought, well, that's an NLCS. I mean, what do you want it to be? $50? It's not going to be that, right? If Adele were playing in the parking lot next door, it'd be $200. And I'm thinking, all right, I mean, how often are there going to be NLCS games? My son and I went to the first ever playoff game in Philadelphia. And this is back in, you tell me, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there. I have a picture of he and I. I'm wearing my Sixto Lescano 83 Philadelphia Bubble P throwback. They were playing the Colorado Rockies. So it must have been 4, 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there. And it was an afternoon game. And I said to my kid, who was 21 at the time, or whatever at the time, and I'm like, hey man, you never been to a playoff game, because he got sick. He was supposed to go to the Yankees playoff game, and he got sick with me. in 97, 96,
Okay.
97. I had to put him in a cab and send him home. So he had never been to a playoff game. So it was a little bit of a
Ah,
running, like, so I took him to Philadelphia. Dude, I paid $100 to a scalper on the street to sit on the roof 20 years ago. 18, however, it feels like 5 minutes ago, but I pulled a picture up. I was younger, so was he. And so I took him to a playoff game in Philly for that very reason many years ago. I didn't go to any of the rest of them. The whole run they went on, Halliday, I didn't go to. I don't know why. I don't know why. I just didn't go to the games. I was happy sitting home watching them on TV. And I don't know why I feel like I wanted to go to one of the games last week all of a sudden, or go up or participate in it in some way and spend $200, which I didn't do. But I could have. I could have gotten in the car. It was $180. I could have clicked the button with juice. Right. It was $210 and be like, okay, I'll suck it up. Go see the Padres. I didn't want to wear my Padres jersey up there because people are jerks. So I didn't go. So the World Series, I started looking. I don't know what I expected it to be. I expected it to be a grand, and it's kind of like that. It's kind of like you might be able to get in for $600 or $700 for a game. Houston was a little cheaper, a little more, $550, $600. Philadelphia's been pretty steady at $900 to $1,000 to have a seat. I'm not shocked by that, knowing that if the Eagles go to the Super Bowl, the tickets will be $4,000, right?
oh yeah.
So knowing that if it's $4,000 to go to a Super Bowl game and you're going to 3 Phillies playoff games and it's $800 to throw, yeah, it's a $2,500 week if you're going to go to games. I'm wondering though, if Freddie Ullman had gotten me tickets to the Padres, what the legitimate price would have been in the old days. The players, if you know a player and they get you a couple of some player gets you tickets, right? Are they $225, $350 seats down on the down in the dugout, or 600, 800? I don't know, but I know it's everybody I know in Philadelphia is like my dude Micah, who makes decent money. He's a lawyer. Is like, he's never paid this much for a ticket in his life. He said to me, to go to World Series games.
So what you're saying, if you're a Philadelphia sports fan, you better be saving your money, because between the Phillies and the Eagles, the way
I
they're
think it's
looking.
different when a team goes to the Super Bowl and they play in Phoenix. You feel like, all right, I'll take a vacation. Yeah. Whatever, I'll do it. When the game's at home, and I feel this way a little bit, like, if I had a World Series in San Diego, I would have paid X hundreds to fly there, X hundreds to be there, X hundreds to eat there, taxes, renting a car, doing what I do, drinking, eating, moving, touristing, whatever I do, and would think like, oh, I went to the World Series in San Diego and I saw a game or two, and Freddie got me tickets and they were $400 a piece, and I turned it into whatever I turned it into in the gas lamp, and I have a good time, see my cousin. Great. I would feel that way. But here, I can get in my car and go up there. If somebody offered me a ticket for $350 tonight, like, which would be kind of face value, I'm guessing is what face value would be, I'd have to say to myself, do I want to go to a World Series game or not? Right? Like, I went to a bunch of them for free for years. And I also bought tickets and sat in the stands for some of them. Kevin Eck and I bought tickets the night that Art Modell moved the team to Baltimore. The next morning, I was on the tarmac. You can do the math on it. Game 5 of the World Series in 1995. Kevin Eck and I sat on the roof with blankets. It was freezing, and we were sitting next to Eric Singer from Kiss. Long hair. He had a blanket pulled up on him and his girlfriend too. But like, so I've sat out in the cold on 42-degree nights watching World Series games. It's not pleasant. I mean, that was part of the Phillies thing, is like, World Series comes October 31st, November 1st, November 2nd. Be 41 degrees in Philadelphia. I mean, somebody wrote me a note in 79 saying, do I remember it snowing? Yeah. I remember being with my dad at game 2, and it was cold. I mean, it was real cold.
That's where you just have to have the football mindset, right? You have to think about it like it's a football game until it is that 4.5 hour game. Yeah.
When in those World Series games in 95, they still had a football team. 97, we had stolen a team. It was like Animal House. Cleveland. Yeah. It go back, and it was unbelievable. It makes this Houston thing look like a tea party. Like, Philly's going to be nuts this week. There's no doubt about that.
Well, you have to remember, in 1995, the Indians, now Guardians, but that was a 5-6 years removed from Major League. I mean, they were everything that we talk about the Cleveland Browns being. That's what the Indians were at that point. You kind of think about what the Indians did from, starting in 94, really. Through, really through the modern day. I mean, they've for the most part, despite the fact that they haven't spent a lot of money at times, and some of the same things we've talked about here in Baltimore as far as ownership and whatnot. But they've been in the playoffs a lot. They've had quite a few games in October at this point. But back then, yeah, you're right. I mean, that was again, speaking as someone who was 12 at the time of the 95 World Series, the Indians being in that was crazy. Like you thought, hey, that's the one team that, even through the Orioles in the late 80s through the early 90s, when, 89 season aside was not very fun as an Orioles fan, you could always count on Cleveland being worse, right? I mean, I think back to 91 with the Orioles, how bad they were in their final year on 33rd Street, but the Indians were worse. So, yeah, it is fun to kind of think about that. And you mentioned the comparison as far as what's the thirst right now in Philadelphia compared to where it is in Houston. And look, Houston's excited about the Astros, but at this point, it's nothing new. I mean, that was 7 years ago. It was wild when they were on the back end of basically where we talk about the comparisons with the Orioles and everything, but them going through 100 lost seasons and suddenly they're in the playoffs. It was kind of nuts, especially in a community where you think of Houston football, right? I mean, you think of football in Texas, you don't think of baseball. So it was a heck of a story then, cheating scandal aside, just how the fans felt about it at the time. But yeah, that novelty starts to, it wears off, and then it becomes the expectation, which is good in a way, but you also think about it in some ways that, it's kind of bad when you think about it, you take that for granted. I mean, we've talked about that with some of our recent conversations about the Ravens and, attendance and, are people, some people take it for granted, maybe more than they did a quarter century ago, which, is understandable, but at the same time, you don't want to take it for granted too much because it is still special. And it is something that from a competitive standpoint, or just flat out having a team, other communities don't take that.
Well, it's special in Philly because this is completely unexpected, and there's no expectation they're going back next year. Like, Houston thinks they're going every year. The Yankees think they're going every year. The Dodgers think they're going every year, right? The Padres know they're not going every year, but know they're pretty good. And around here, I hear all this cockiness about, oh, we're going to be good. Man, you get the one World Series, one time, one shot. You feel good. I mean, look at Kansas City. That thing came and went San Francisco, they're wondering if they're ever going to get back to winning every other year, right? Like, it's not easy to do. The Angels had their moment with Socha and all that stuff. Now they got two of the best players on earth, and they can't sniff the playoffs.
Yeah. I mean, it can be very fleeting. That's why, to bring it back to the Ravens for just a moment, that's why when I heard people talk about the 2019 team, I mean, we saw what that was. 14-2, 12 in a row. Boat racing teams week after week after week. They were easily the best team in the NFL in the regular season. Now, hey, Kansas City won the Super Bowl. They deserve credit. They were the last team standing at the end. But that's why people who said, well, they're ahead of schedule. They were a year ahead of where we thought they'd be. You can't treat it that way because you don't know what's going to happen, let alone a pandemic soon set in at that point in time. And we saw how that disrupted the NFL for 2 years. So I mean, it's just, it's one of those deals where you don't want to take it for granted because for every dynasty that does actually turn out, you have so many where we're talking about teams being a dynasty and they never get back. They never get back. It's one and done, or, maybe they get there twice and they come up short the second time, whatever it might be. So when you have that, I mean, Philadelphia, let's be clear about something here. They're not the underdog in the sense that they have a low payroll and they've spent a lot of money. I mean, Dave Dombrowski spent a lot of money on that team. That's why there was such a disenchantment with what was happening under Joe Girardi. So they make the change, and in some ways, from a financial standpoint, they started living up to expectations. But you're right. Is there any guarantee that they'll be back next year? No. I think they could be good next year, but it doesn't mean you're going to get back to the World Series. It's
well,
crazy.
You like the Orioles odds of being there more than you like the Phillies odds right now, especially once they signed DeGrom and go out and spend all this money.
Right. That was an interesting rumor to see over the weekend. I mean, it was just some kind of an anonymous.
Here, you and I had to do 4 hours a day of this ish. It would just be that would be all we would do is sit here and talk about rumorama of DJ Moore coming to the ring. Like I can't spend my days doing that. But when they sign a real pitcher around here and give a real contract out, I would say I want to be at the press conference, but I'll make sure you're there.
Yeah, I'll say this much. I'll even give you scenarios where they spend money or go get a starting pitcher of some very legitimate credibility. I'd be really surprised if it's Jacob deGrom, though. I mean, one, the price is going to be extraordinary. And the other thing that would make me nervous, whether, hey, it's not my money at the end of the
Why
day.
him?
DeGrom's, he has had some health concerns the last year or two. As much as you love the guy, I mean, he's been extraordinary over the last 6 or 7 years. I mean, he's phenomenal, but he has had some arm issues that make me nervous too. I mean, as exciting as it would be, and I'm not saying don't do it. Let's be clear about that. If the Orioles are in on it, hey, why not? It's not my money at the end of the day. But
Aaron
yeah,
Judge, baby. Move the
I
fences in. Let's go.
yeah, exactly. Aaron Judge, the guy who was the most vocal critic about the left field wall. That's one I could feel very confident in saying, no, you will not see Aaron Judge in Baltimore. But because of the left field
Now
wall
you're
alone,
talking
maybe.
sense. Now you're being a legitimate. This is why I employ you and keep you around. Because anytime you're talking about a premier free agent base, you know enough to know they're not signing that guy.
I mean,
I've watched this for 30
yeah.
years. They courted Mark Teixeira. We offered Messina plenty of money. We offered him plenty of money. I've watched this too long, and I've seen Fredo and Fredo too, and Mama, and they were in court last week. I don't have high expectations in that way. My expectations are lower than you and Ed Lauer when it comes to how they're going to run it and how they're going to spend money. They have a long, long history of liking money more than giving it away as a family.
And hey, until they prove otherwise, that's completely fair. I'm not even saying I disagree with you on that. I think they're going to spend some, but what does some mean? I mean, you look at where the payroll has been.
Mama wants
Doesn't
to
mean it's
sell
going
the
up.
team. Mama's not handing the team with debt to anybody. I'll talk to Leonard Raskin about that later.
Right. Well, and that's why I'm saying like anyone who thinks that they're going to go back to having a $150 million payroll like they did in 2016, no, don't hold your breath for that whatsoever. Can they spend some money though? Yeah, because their payroll has literally been that small the last couple of years. But
You're
again, I
coming
think
at
it's
it
going to
sensibly, and then you got to consider who these people are that run it, and it's not even about Mike Elias. It's about, are we going to invest 20, 30, 40, 50 million more dollars in this baseball team next year when we've already got Ed Lauer running the bases and we sold some tickets and Jacob deGrom's not going to sell tickets and we're good enough. And look at what Philadelphia did. Look at what the young teams are doing. We're fine. I just don't see Mama stroking a pen on an $80 million check for a pitcher. I can't fathom in the environment they're in with the infighting they have with their family. My expectations are much lower than the fan bases.
Yeah. Well, hey, I think there are lots of fans that are skeptical. I think there are lots of fans who really love the farm system. As you mentioned, it's not remotely a Mike Elias thing. I'm happy with what Mike Elias has done.
Mike Elias are running the Dodgers right now. He could go win. He'd have money.
Well, I mean, you could, but that's the big thing, and this is where we go back to thinking about it from a standpoint of changes that Major League Baseball has made. Yeah, when you expand the playoff field, everyone talks about the sense of, well, that more teams will feel like they're in it, and then they'll spend, or it's like, or it could be they're in it, but they feel like they don't have to spend because you could say, okay, Philadelphia's payroll aside, I mean, the Phillies, they have an expensive payroll. So, but looking at them in terms of being the sixth best team in the National League this year, that's where you look at it and say, how much do I need to spend to be in that realm where I could be the final wild card? And then, hey, we've said it. Billy Beane said it, in Moneyball 20 years ago. The playoffs are a crapshoot. You roll the dice. Buck Showalter said it a decade ago. Get a chance to roll the dice in October. And we've seen it. Quite often, the best team does not win the World Series. So there's an argument to be made that, hey, we can spend enough, which does not have to be $200 million a year, to be the sixth best team in the league. We can get in the playoffs and, hey, the stars align, which they kind of need to anyway. The dirty little secret about sports is there's more luck and good fortune involved in it than we'd like to admit more often than not. So you get a chance to get in and give it a shot, and you don't even have to spend all that money. So that's the more cynical way of looking at it. But I guarantee that's the reason why the MLB Players Association did not want an expanded playoff field and why they were they were balking at that. So, I mean, baseball wanted to add an extra playoff team more than what we already have. So, they're still going to want that because all they care about is playoff baseball TV revenue. Never mind what that means for your regular season product.
Before he passed, Mike Flanagan once told me that Andy McPhail said to him, Why feed them steak when they'll eat hamburger? So I'll just let that one marinate out there for those of you who like to marinate your steak or your hamburger. I'll be marinating a crab cake. We'll be at the Fountain at Drug City in Dundalk. I'm looking forward to it on Friday. Be there from 2 until 5. Got a lot of great guests stopping by. Feel free to stop by if you're in the neighborhood. Have a crab cake, sit down, have a milkshake. Get a beer, get some wrestling magazines. We'll talk about old times. Luke will be out in Owings Mills whenever John Harbaugh permits this week. Monday night, Monday. Got a whole Thursday and Sunday to sit around and watch football here this weekend. You can find me, Ness, at BaltimorePositive.com. Luke is Luke at WNST.net. And, of course, our Maryland Crab Cake Tour presented by our friends at the Maryland Lottery in conjunction with Goodwill and Window Nation. We're making it happen. We'll see you on Friday in Dundalk. We're going to be around all week. I am Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570. Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking World Series, Ravens in New Orleans, and Baltimore Positive. A little election, too.